An old theater stood at the edge of the city, its wooden floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps, its red velvet curtains faded by time, its chandeliers casting a warm but imperfect light across rows of silent faces. And despite the beauty of the place, something about it felt heavier than it should have, as if the walls themselves had absorbed too many arguments, too many certainties, too many truths spoken with absolute confidence. And on that evening the theater was full, not with performers, but with listeners, scholars, believers, skeptics, men and women who came not to be entertained, but to hear ideas tested in public. Because public certainty has always been stronger than private doubt, and doubt, when exposed before others, becomes difficult to hide. And at the center of that old stage stood Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, still, almost detached from the anticipation around him, as if the silence before the first word interested him more than the words themselves. And that alone unsettled people, because confidence usually announces itself, but real certainty rarely does. And one of the men in the front row, dressed with the posture of someone used to being listened to, leaned forward and asked a question that many in the theater had already brought with them, asking whether it was true that Nietzsche believed good and evil were not real, whether he truly believed that the foundations of morality were nothing more than human invention, and the question moved through the audience before Nietzsche ever answered, because some questions create tension simply by being spoken aloud, and morality is one of them, because people can live without answers for many things, but they struggle to live without believing that right and wrong are fixed, clear, and eternal. And Nietzsche did not answer immediately, and that silence created something unexpected, because the audience had expected argument, defense, or confrontation, but instead they were given stillness, and stillness forces attention, and attention, when held long enough, creates pressure. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost softer than expected. And he said that the most dangerous lie is not what people call evil, but what people call good, without ever asking who defined it. And the words did not land as an attack. They landed as something far more difficult to dismiss, because they did not deny morality. They questioned its origin, and when origin is questioned, certainty begins to weaken. And the theater reacted not loudly, but inwardly, because confusion is always quieter than disagreement. And one of the men laughed, lightly at first, dismissing the statement as intellectual provocation, saying that every civilization, every religion, every law had always understood the difference between good and evil. And the laughter spread, not because it was understood, but because it restored comfort. And comfort is what people reach for when something familiar begins to feel unstable. And Nietzsche did not react, did not defend his statement. And that lack of reaction slowly began to change the rhythm of the room. Because when a man refuses to defend what he knows, others begin to question what they know. And the laughter became thinner, less certain, and the theater, once warm and predictable, no longer felt entirely safe. The laughter did not disappear all at once, but it changed, becoming thinner, less natural, as if it were no longer sustained by confidence, but by habit. And habit, once exposed, begins to lose its strength, because what once felt automatic begins to feel repeated, and repetition, when seen clearly, creates distance between a person and what they are doing. And that distance is where awareness begins, and awareness is what the people in the theater had not expected, because awareness interrupts comfort, and comfort is what held everything together until that moment. And now something had disrupted it, something small, something simple, but enough to create tension. And tension, once introduced, does not remain contained. It spreads quietly, inwardly, from one person to another, not through agreement, but through presence. Because discomfort does not need consensus. It only needs to be felt. And once it is felt, it changes the way everything is experienced, the way words are heard, the way beliefs are defended, the way a person observes themselves in presence of others. And the people in the theater felt that shift, even if they resisted it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the structure they relied on. And when something does not fit, the mind tries to correct it, to dismiss it, to push it aside. But dismissal requires certainty, and certainty had already begun to weaken, and one of the men stood again, this time without laughter, his voice lower, more controlled, asking what Nietzsche meant more precisely, asking whether he was suggesting that murder, betrayal, cruelty, and compassion had no moral meaning, whether all human judgment was nothing more than interpretation. And the question carried resistance, but also something deeper, something closer to fear, because the idea had begun to settle not as an argument, but as a possibility, and possibilities are far more difficult to reject than statements, because they do not require agreement. They simply exist. And Friedrich Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that people often confuse moral language with moral truth, that what society calls good is often what preserves its stability, and what it calls evil is often what threatens its comfort. And the words moved the theater differently this time, because they did not attack morality directly. They redefined its function, and redefining something so deeply embedded creates instability, because it forces people to reconsider what they have always accepted without question, and that reconsideration is not comfortable. It does not resolve quickly. It lingers. It creates tension, and the audience felt that tension deepen, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now each person present had been pulled into the statement, not as an observer, but as a subject, and being a subject removes distance. And without distance, resistance becomes harder to maintain, and Nietzsche continued, saying that for centuries people had inherited values the same way they inherit language, absorbing them long before they understand them, defending them long before they question them, and living by them long before they choose them. And because those values arrive early, they do not feel imposed, they feel natural, and what feels natural is rarely questioned, and what is not questioned becomes morality. And morality, once accepted by many, becomes authority, and authority, once repeated across generations, begins to feel eternal, even when it began as nothing more than human necessity. And the words settled into theater with quiet weight, because they did not demand reaction, they demanded reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, more difficult to avoid, and the man who had spoken did not respond immediately, and that hesitation revealed something new, because earlier reactions had been immediate, automatic, but now something had interrupted that automatic response. Something had slowed it down, and once thought slows, it begins to deepen, and depth is where discomfort grows, and Nietzsche, seeing this, did not push harder, did not escalate, because the moment had already shifted. And escalation would have broken what had begun to form. And instead, he said that the most dangerous values are not the ones people reject, but the ones people obey without ever asking who benefits from their obedience. And the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not accuse. They revealed, and revelation is far more difficult to resist, because it does not demand agreement. It creates recognition, and recognition, once it begins, cannot be easily undone, and the theater, once held together by shared certainty, now held something entirely different, something unstable, something unresolved, something that no longer responded to simple dismissal, and within that shift, something had already begun to break, even if no one was ready to admit it, because what they were feeling was not confusion. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet realization that what they had always called morality might not have begun with truth, but with necessity. And for the first time, certain no longer felt sacred. The theater did not fall silent all at once. It happened slowly. One breath, one hesitation, one unfinished thought at a time. And that made it far more unsettling, because sudden silence can be explained, but silence that grows from within cannot. And the people sitting beneath the dim chandeliers felt it, even if they could not fully understand it, because something had entered the space that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they heard, the way they judged, the way they understood the words they had trusted their entire lives. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it forces change, but because it makes change unavoidable. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood at the center of that old stage, not as someone who had attacked morality, but as someone who had revealed its fragility and revealing. Fragility is far more dangerous than direct opposition, because opposition creates enemies, but revelation creates doubt, and doubt, once it begins, does not leave easily. And one of the men in the front row spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of the certainty it once carried, asking what remains if good and evil are not absolute, if morality is not eternal, if values are not written into the structure of existence itself. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but fear. And fear is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something fundamental begins to weaken. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that what remains is responsibility, because once a person realizes that values are not discovered but created, obedience becomes a choice rather than a duty, and choice is heavier than obedience, because obedience offers comfort, direction, and belonging, while choice demands awareness, courage, and the willingness to stand alone. And the words did not comfort the audience, they deepened the tension, because responsibility is always heavier than inherited belief. And most people prefer inherited belief because it removes the burden of deciding for themselves and the people. In the theater felt that weight begin to settle, not as agreement, but as pressure, because now the question was no longer philosophical. It had become personal, and personal questions are always harder to escape, and Nietzsche spoke again, his voice steady, saying that the greatest moral systems are often not built to reveal truth, but to create order. And order is not the same as truth, because truth does not need permission, while order always does. And the words moved through the theater with a kind of quiet finality, because they did not attack religion, law, or society directly. They revealed something beneath all of them, the possibility that what people call virtue may sometimes be nothing more than collective fear organized into rules, and that idea settled deeper than anything before it, because it did not ask the audience to reject morality. It forced them to question its origin, and once origin is questioned, certainty begins to fracture, and fractured certainty cannot easily be repaired through denial alone. And no one laughed now, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already shifted, something that could not be undone through reaction. And Nietzsche spoke one final time, saying that the most dangerous people are not those who do evil, but those who obey good without ever asking why it was called good in the first place. And the word settled into theater with finality, not as an argument, but as something that could not be. Unheard once understood, and no one responded, because there was no response that could restore what had existed before the question was asked. And Nietzsche turned and walked away, his footsteps quiet against the old wooden stage. And as he disappeared, behind the velvet curtains, the theater remained exactly as it had been, and yet none of it felt the same, because once a person begins to question whether morality was discovered or designed, they cannot fully return to the comfort of certainty, and what remained was not silence, but something far more unsettling, the quiet awareness that good and evil may have shaped their lives long before they ever chose to believe in either of them. The theater did not fall silent all at once. It happened slowly, one breath, one hesitation, one unfinished thought at a time.